The door was unlocked. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. My son always locked his door. Even when he was home, even on Sunday afternoons when he was just watching the game, the deadbolt was always turned. He'd been that way since his late 20s, ever since someone broke into his old apartment on Wellington Street and stole his laptop and his grandmother's watch. After that, locked doors became something close to religion for him. So when I turned the handle and it just opened, I stood there for a moment on the front step, hands still on the knob, listening. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because to understand why I was standing at my son's door on a Tuesday afternoon in November, you have to go back about 6 weeks. My wife's name is Audrey. We've been married for 41 years. She grew up in Moncton, I grew up just outside of Kingston, and we met in our second year at Queen's. She was studying social work, I was in business administration, and we were both in the same terrible 8 a.m. economics lecture. Neither of us wanted to be in. I used to say that class ruined any chance I had of sleeping past 7 for the rest of my life. She'd laugh every time, even after 30 years of hearing it. We retired 3 years ago. I was 62, she was 61. We planned it carefully. The house was paid off, our RRSP was where it needed to be, and we had enough in our TFSA to cover the gaps. We weren't wealthy by any standard, but we were comfortable. Comfortable enough that when our son Trevor asked if we could help him with a down payment on a house 2 years ago, we said yes. $120,000. In the Toronto market, that was what it took to give a young family a real start. He was grateful, or at least I believed he was. Trevor is our only child. Audrey had complications after his birth, and there were no more children after that. So everything we had went to him. Not in a spoiling way. Not the way you see on those TV shows where parents buy their kids sports cars and wonder why they turned out entitled. We raised him with values. Work hard. Tell the truth. Take care of your family. He grew up watching us do all three. He married his wife. I'll call her Renata, because that's not her name and I'd rather not use her real one. About 8 years ago. I had reservations from the beginning that I kept mostly to myself. She was charming when she wanted to be and cold when she didn't, and the switch between the two happened fast enough that it gave you whiplash. But Trevor loved her, and I loved Trevor. So I kept my mouth shut and told myself I was just being overprotective. They had one daughter together, our granddaughter Claire, who is now 4 years old and who has absolutely nothing to do with any of this except that I want you to know she existed, that she was there in that house, that she is the reason I kept myself from doing something I couldn't take back. The trouble started, I think, long before I noticed it. It usually does. 6 weeks before I found myself standing at that unlocked door, Audrey went to visit Clever and Renata for what was supposed to be a long weekend. They live in Barrie, about 90 minutes north of where we are in Hamilton. She went up on a Friday afternoon, and I stayed home because I had a follow-up appointment with my cardiologist that I'd already rescheduled twice. Minor stuff. Arrhythmia. Nothing dangerous, just something we monitored every few months. I figured I'd drive up Saturday after my appointment. Saturday morning, I called Audrey to tell her I was heading out. No answer. I tried again an hour later. Nothing. I texted. Nothing. I told myself she'd left her phone in the other room. She did that sometimes. I drove up to Barrie, and when I got there, Trevor met me at the door and said Audrey had already gone home. She left this morning, he said, early. She wasn't feeling well. I turned around and drove home. She wasn't there. I called her cell again. Nothing. I want to tell you that I panicked right away, that I immediately knew something was wrong. But the truth is, I spent almost 2 days convincing myself there was a reasonable explanation. She'd stopped somewhere. Her phone had died. She was visiting her friend Donna in Burlington without telling me. We'd been married long enough that I could construct a dozen innocent explanations before I reached for a frightening one. By Sunday evening, when I still hadn't heard from her and her phone was going straight to voicemail, I called Trevor. He seemed unsurprised. That was the thing I kept coming back to in the weeks that followed. He seemed unsurprised. She probably just needed some space, Dad, he said. You know how she gets sometimes. I did not know how she gets. I had been married to this woman for 41 years. She did not need space without telling me. That had never once been true. But Trevor said it so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that for a moment I second-guessed myself. That was the beginning of the second-guessing, and it didn't stop for a long time. I filed a missing person report with Hamilton Police that Sunday night. The officer I spoke to was kind but measured. Adult women leave of their own accord sometimes, he explained. Did she have any reason to want to get away? Was there any conflict in our marriage? Had anything unusual happened recently? I answered no to all three and came home feeling like I'd failed some kind of test. The following week was the worst week of my life, and I have had some bad weeks. My father died when I was 38. I had a health scare when I was 55 that turned out to be nothing but took 3 months off my life in the meantime. But this was different. This was the specific, grinding terror of not knowing. Not knowing where she was, not knowing if she was safe, not knowing whether to be grieving or searching or waiting. Trevor called every couple of days. The conversations were short and oddly cheerful. He asked how I was holding up. He told me I should eat properly. He mentioned once, very casually, that Audrey had always been a bit unpredictable. I had no idea what he meant by that. She was the most steady person I had ever known. Renata called once. She said she was sorry I was going through this and hoped everything worked out. It sounded like a sympathy card from someone you barely know. By the third week, I started doing things I'm not particularly proud of. I went through our bank statements. Not because I suspected Audrey of anything, but because I was looking for evidence that she was alive. A debit purchase at a gas station somewhere, a withdrawal, anything. What I found instead made me sit down at the kitchen table and stay there for a long time. 3 weeks before Audrey went to Barrie, someone had made a series of transfers from our joint savings account. 4 transfers over 10 days, each one just under $10,000. Total, $38,000. The transfers went to an account I didn't recognize. I called the bank the next morning. They confirmed the transfers had been authorized using Audrey's online banking credentials. Her username, her password, her security questions. Technically, there was nothing fraudulent about them. I thought about it for a long time before I called Trevor. I wanted to give him the chance to explain. I told myself there was a reason, that maybe Audrey had moved the money for some purpose I wasn't aware of. That maybe there was something I was missing. I don't know anything about that, Trevor said. Very calm. Very even. Mom handles her own finances sometimes, doesn't she? She did not. We'd always managed our money together. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I think it matters. I could have gone to the police that day with what I knew. I had bank records, a missing wife, a son whose timeline didn't add up. But I didn't. I waited. Partly because I was still hoping for that innocent explanation. Partly because the idea that my own child could be behind this, that the boy I'd coached in hockey, that the young man I'd driven to his first job interview, that the person I had given everything I had given, was simply beyond what I was willing to accept. So instead, I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I lied. The next time Trevor called, I told him I wasn't feeling well. Dizzy, forgetful, struggling to concentrate. I said the stress was getting to me. That I wasn't sure I could manage things on my own. I said I was having trouble remembering passwords. That I'd gotten confused at the pharmacy. That I was worried about myself. I could hear something change in his voice. It was subtle. A small relaxation. Like a shoulder dropping. You should come stay with us for a bit, he said. We have the spa room. Renata and I can keep an eye on you. I said I'd think about it. I didn't go. But I kept up the act on the phone. A few days later, he asked me about our investment accounts. Just wondering, he said, just thinking about the future and whether I had things in order. I said I wasn't sure where the paperwork was, that things were all mixed up, that maybe he could come down and help me sort through it. He drove down that Friday. I sat at the kitchen table and let him go through the filing cabinet in my office while I stared at the wall and played confused. He found the account statements for our RRSP, the insurance policy, the title on the house. I watched him photograph them with his phone. I said nothing. I kept my face blank, but my hands under the table were shaking. That evening, after he left, I called a lawyer, a woman I'd been referred to by an old colleague from my working days. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting and then said, very quietly, "Do you have any idea where your wife might physically be?" I didn't, but I was starting to think I needed to find out. It was another week before everything came together. I'd been in contact with the detective who'd taken over the missing persons case. A methodical man named, well, I'll call him the detective. He'd been piecing things together on his end, and I'd been feeding him what I found on mine, the bank transfers, the photographs of my financial documents, The timeline of Trevor's calls and how they changed in character after I started pretending to be confused. On a Tuesday afternoon, the detective called me. He said they'd gotten a warrant. He said he thought I should come. I drove to Barrie in just over an hour. I don't remember most of that drive. I remember the 400 North felt very empty, and the sky had that flat grey look that November gets in Ontario, and I had the radio off because I couldn't stand any noise. The detective met me 2 streets over from Trevor's house. He explained that they'd already gone in, that the scene was contained, that I could come but I needed to prepare myself. Prepare myself for what? I asked. He looked at me for a moment. Your wife is alive, he said first. I want you to know that before anything else. I think I said thank you. I'm not sure. He walked me around to the back of the house and down through the side door into the attached garage. There was a door in the back wall of the garage. I'd never noticed it before, in all the times I'd been to that house for dinners and Christmases and Claire's birthday parties. It looked like a utility closet. There was a padlock on it. They'd already cut the lock off. One of the officers opened the door and stepped back. The room behind it was small and cold. A cot along one wall. A space heater in the corner that wasn't on. A bucket. A single bare light bulb overhead. And my wife, sitting on the edge of the cot, wrapped in a blanket, blinking in the light. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said my name. I don't know how I got across that room. I don't remember moving. I just remember being on my knees in front of her with her hands in mine, and how cold her hands were, and how she kept saying my name over and over, and how I couldn't say anything at all. She'd been there for almost 5 weeks. Renata had brought her food and water twice a day. That was important. The detective told me later that was how she survived. It wasn't neglect in the physical sense. It was a calculated cruelty. Keep her alive, keep her compliant, keep her scared, keep her from doing anything that would interfere with what they were trying to do. What they were trying to do, as near as anyone could piece together, was this. With Audrey out of the way and me apparently declining into confusion, they intended to get power of attorney. Trevor had already researched it. There were notes on his computer. A timeline, a list of our assets with estimated values. It was meticulous and it was cold, and it was the work of someone who had been thinking about it for a long time. They took Claire to Renata's mother in Collingwood before the arrest. I was grateful for that. Not for their sake, for Claire's. Trevor was arrested in the driveway as he pulled in from work. I wasn't there for that part. I was at the hospital with Audrey, sitting in a plastic chair while he examined her, waiting for the moment they would say she could leave. She had some muscle weakness from the inactivity, mild dehydration despite the water she'd been given, and a bruise on her wrist from the one time early on when she'd fought back and Renata had grabbed her hard enough to leave a mark. She had a chest cold, and she was emotionally shattered in ways that took months to begin to understand. But she was alive. She was going to be fine. I've been asked since then how I felt about Trevor. People want the answer to be simple. They want it to be rage or grief, something clean and nameable. The honest answer is that in those first hours, I didn't feel much of anything at all. There's a numbness that sets in when something is too large to process. I sat in that hospital chair and held Audrey's hand and looked at the wall and felt nothing except an enormous tiredness. The rage came later. It came in waves over the following weeks. Usually at night, usually quiet. I would lie awake thinking about the phone calls. The calm, measured voice telling me my wife had always been a bit unpredictable. The shoulder dropping when I pretended not to understand my own finances. The photographs of our account statements on his phone. Audrey started seeing a therapist in December. I started going in January. We went separately and we went together. It was slow and it was hard, and there were nights when she woke up at 2 in the morning, convinced she was still in that room. There were mornings when I had to talk her through it, step by step, until she remembered where she was. But there were also good mornings. There were mornings when I came downstairs and found her at the kitchen table with coffee and the crossword, looking for all the world like nothing had happened. And I would stand in the doorway for a moment just watching her, and something in my chest would loosen. Trevor was charged with unlawful confinement, fraud over $5,000, and breach of trust. Renata faced similar charges. Their case moved through the Ontario court system with the pace these things typically move. Slowly and with a great deal of paperwork. I won't say more than that because parts of it are still unresolved. The $38,000 was recovered. Our lawyer was very good. We don't see Claire the way we should. That's the part that still keeps me up some nights. She's 4 years old and she doesn't understand any of this. And whatever relationship she has with her grandparents has been torn up by decisions she had no part in making. Renata's mother has been decent about it. We've been working with a family mediator. It's not what I'd hoped for, but it's something. People ask me sometimes if I saw it coming. If there were signs I ignored. If I blame myself. The answer to the last one is yes. Of course I do. Some part of me would probably always pull at that thread. The moment I decided to keep my reservations to myself, the years of overlooking the small coldnesses, the days I spent waiting for an innocent explanation when I should have been moving faster. But here's what I've learned. For whatever it's worth, love is not the same as trust, and they do not always travel together. You can love someone completely and still not see what they're capable of. That's not naivety. That's just what it is to be a parent. Audrey and I are still in Hamilton. We still have coffee in the morning. She still does the crossword, and I still can't finish the cryptic clues without her help. In the spring, we drove up to the Bruce Peninsula for a week and walked along the escarpment and ate bad fish and chips at a place overlooking Georgian Bay. And I watched her laugh at something stupid I said. And I thought, this is what they were trying to take. They didn't get it. That matters. Some days, it's the only thing that matters. If you're watching this and something about it sounds familiar, if you felt that slow creep of doubt about someone you were supposed to be able to trust, I want you to know that noticing it is not a betrayal. Protecting yourself and the people you love is not a betrayal. It took me too long to understand that, and I paid for it. We both did. But we are still here. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the garage door, not the cot, not Audrey's cold hands in mine. It's earlier than that. It's Trevor's voice on the phone saying she's always been a bit unpredictable. And the half second where I almost believed him. That's the moment that taught me the most. Not what he did. What I almost let him do to my own judgment. I've thought a lot about why it took me as long as it did to act. Part of it was love. And I won't apologize for that. You don't stop trusting someone you raised just because a voice in the back of your head starts asking questions. But part of it was something else. A willingness to accept a comfortable explanation over a hard truth. Because the hard truth was too much to sit with. That's not love. That's avoidance. And avoidance has a cost. The bank statements were sitting in that account history for weeks before I looked. The signs were there before Audrey ever drove to Barrie. I'm not saying I should have known everything sooner. I'm saying I knew something was off and I kept filing it away. There's a difference between not seeing and not looking, and I was doing the second one. What turned things around, oddly enough, was the decision to be dishonest, to play confused, to let Trevor think he had the upper hand when I was quietly building a picture. That felt strange to me at the time. I've always believed in being straight with people, in saying what I mean, but I came to understand that being honest doesn't mean being passive. Sometimes protecting the people you love requires you to be smarter than the person trying to hurt them. Trevor was counting on my decency to make me slow. I use my decency differently. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this. If they're in a place where something doesn't feel right, but they can't quite name it yet, you don't have to have proof before you start paying attention. You don't have to wait until you're certain before you start asking questions. The instinct that something is wrong is worth listening to. It was right in my case, it might be right in yours. Audrey did her work after. She sat in a therapist's office twice a week for months and she did not pretend it was fine when it wasn't. That took more strength than I think people understand. It would have been easy and tempting to say she was okay, to get back to normal life as fast as possible, to not look at what had happened too directly. She looked at it anyway. That's not nothing. That's everything actually. We're both still here. We still have the house, the crossword, the bad fish and chips up on Georgian Bay. Trevor made choices that had consequences he didn't anticipate, because people who think they're clever enough to get away with something usually haven't thought far enough to get away with something, usually haven't thought far enough. That's how it goes. The plan was detailed and cold and it still fell apart, because he underestimated the one thing he should have taken seriously. That I was paying attention and that I wasn't going to stop. I'm 64 years old, and I've learned that life does not sort itself out without your help. But it also doesn't require you to face it alone. Ask for help when you need it. Pay attention when something feels wrong. And don't confuse keeping the peace with keeping yourself safe. Those two things are not the same.